Hey everybody, welcome to today's class plan. So for today, I would like to talk to you a little bit about audience and purpose. So in terms of your own project, if you would, scroll down to the tables down here, find your name, click in when you find your name into your world building worksheets, which are all wonderful. Thank you very much for doing such a nice job on it. So to help move your drafting process along, if you would just respond to these series of questions no later than Friday night. So it should only take about 10-15 minutes. So what's your title? Give it a snazzy title that's memorable, that draws in audiences. But before, or I guess at the same time, think about who is your audience, right? So what sort of audience do you imagine for this project? And then what sorts of choices can you make to persuade your audience to pay attention to what it is you have to say and to better communicate your ideas? After that, if you would, give a just kind of couple sentence top line. Describe your world to someone who hasn't been there, doesn't know what it is, maybe somebody outside of the class, parent, friend, something like that. And then use this couple sentences as an opportunity to persuade them to go, or if the place that you are imagining is terrifying, to warn them against it. And then finally, think briefly about and then describe any narrative or fictional features that you plan to use in your final version of this to help draw audiences in, to help communicate your purpose. All right, so moving on to our next part, if you would. Okay, so again, we're using Thomas More's Utopia as a kind of model or template for the work that we're doing. If we were in class, we would have had much more time to do this. But to just think about what I'm asking you to do, I think one thing to keep in mind is maybe starting even with Utopia itself. Remember, Utopia is a word that means no place, right? So just like Moore's title, how can your title do a couple different things at the same time? I'm going to ask you guys to do some illustrating for next class, but just for now, here is the frontispiece that was published with the book in 1516 that both provides kind of imaginative location, but is at the same time totally fictional, right? So we have on the one hand maps that do this sort of rational intellectual work, but in this context, the map is a fiction. And so how does the kind of fictionalizing of real world events help persuade Moore's audience to pay attention to its content, and how can you kind of riff on those themes in the work that you're doing? So just quickly picking up on that, you remember that the situation or the actual plot of Moore's Utopia is this guy, Thomas More, who's both the author and then one of the main characters in this dialogue, spends time or travels to what is now present day Belgium, to meet with heads of state there. But really, while he's there, he hangs out with his good friend Peter Giles, who you can see featured here. Real men, friends in real life, but also the figures in this fictional dialogue. While they're there, Giles introduces Moore to this fellow Hythloday. So here's a woodcut that was printed with the 1518 reprint of Moore's text. And then the main action of the text takes place while the three of these guys hang out talking about social inequity, problems besetting England, and provide their suggestions for it. So next question that pertains to both Moore's text and yours is, why do you think Thomas More communicated his critique of England's social and economic problems through an imaginary dialogue. There's lots of answers to this, and a lot of you guys probably already know a lot about this stuff, having taken English classes previously, but we can think about More's text as a kind of parody of both the tales told by travelers, right? Here's a picture. Where'd that picture go? Come on, picture. All right. So anyway, but the tales told by travelers, of whom Raphael Hythloday, remember this figure right here, the central figure, is exemplary. So unlike More and Giles, Hythloday is a fiction, like a complete and total fiction. His name means peddler of nonsense. So like Utopia is no place. Giles is a character who speaks nonsense, which is a kind of send up of something like Plato's dialogues, and also of the traveler's tales that were an important component of the genres that people in the 1516s were interested in reading. Okay, so a reason to, among many, locate this story and critique of problems facing real world England at the time, namely poverty, right, and theft, is something that we find even today, that the king at the center of More's world, Henry VIII specifically, but then monarchy in general, is unlikely to be persuaded by anything that counselors have to say, in part because the counselors are always competing with one another, and also because the king is more interested in acquiring new territories than like public work projects, right? And you can see that all over More's Utopia, but specifically here when Giles asks Hythloday why he hasn't gone to go work for a king. So again, why is it important for us to be writing fictional dialogues? So why are you writing a fiction instead of writing just a paper? So on the one hand, and the answer is perhaps there's a way that writing these fictions cuts through to audiences and helps persuade them of the usefulness of your claim in a way that expository writing just doesn't. All right. Okay, so among the many points of critique in book one is this centers around this sort of claim that English sheep are killing English men. So let's take a look at that really fast. Whoops. Okay. So we have in the figure of the lawyer, right, in this fictional dialogue that Hythloday recounts in the real-time dialogue that he's having with More and Giles. He recounts his experience of going to dinner at Cardinal Morton's house, who Morton is himself a real historical figure, where he encounters these men, among whom is a lawyer who argues that beggars are a consequence of moral failing, to which Hythloday responds, I disagree, and he argues that instead beggars or thieves are actually the consequence of these broad social forces. And so why in England are people stealing more, stealing to the point where the execution of thieves has become a kind of overwhelming grotesquerie as opposed to being a deterrent, right? And so Hythloday goes through all of these different reasons, right? So there's a bunch of wars that cause disabled veterans to come back and have no livelihood. He argues that that there's just too much what he calls luxury. So he says there's all these sort of like rich nobles who keep like a kind of like a posse around them, and then those people become um, softened with the effeminate manner of life, and they're less fit for action if they were well bred, and blah blah blah. And so like the sort of nobility are producing this sort of like idle class who themselves become like vagrants and beggars. And then also this idea of the enclosure of the pastures, which is where we get this business with the sheep. And so he says, you know, instead of using these lands that are held in common and have been held in common since time immemorial to farm, there's this, again, kind of a social problem of valuing the wrong things, and that is valuing the wool that sheep can produce, and so that like nobility can make a bunch of money, as opposed to valuing food that can sustain life. And so in that way, the increase of your pasture, by which your sheep, which are naturally mild and easily kept in order, may now be said to devour men and unpeople not only villagers but towns. For wherever it's found that the sheep of any soil yield a softer, richer wool than ordinary, their nobility and gentry, and even those holy men, the abbots, not content with the old rents which their farms yielded, nor thinking it enough that they, living at their ease, do no good to the public, resolve to do it hurt instead of good. They stop the course of agriculture, destroying houses and towns, reserving only the churches and enclosing grounds that they may lodge their sheep in them. Right. So he says that like here is this failure that's not a moral failure, but rather a failure of certain type of economy, certain type of production that shouldn't be redressed through capital punishment, but instead through a kind of public work project, right? So one of the broadest public work projects that he suggests, and this is where I'll stop, he says, it's upon these reasons, right, in response, it's upon these reasons that I think putting thieves to death is not lawful, and it's plain and obvious that it's absurd and of ill consequence to the commonwealth that a thief and a murderer should be equally punished. For if a robber sees that his danger is the same, and he's convicted of theft as if he were guilty of murder, this will naturally incite him to kill the person who blah, 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 blah. All right, so he says, here are the social conditions that underwrite the causes of poverty and theft. And no amount of capital punishment in the world will deter the like theft and poverty. Instead, he says, why not employ this kind of broad public works projects in which thieves are condemned to serve the public works, but are neither imprisoned or chained, unless there happens to be some extraordinary circumstances in their crimes. They go about loose and free, working for the public. If they are idle or backward to work, they are whipped. But if they work hard, they are well used and treated without any mark of reproach. Only the least of them are called away at night, and then are shut up. They suffer no other unease but this of constant labor, for, as they work for the public, so they are well entertained out of public stock, which is done differently in different places. In some places, whatever is bestowed on them is raised by a charitable contribution, and though this way may seem uncertain, yet so merciful are the inclinations of people that they are plentifully supplied. But in other places, public revenues are set aside, blah, 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 blah. But this means there's always some piece of work or other to be done by them, and beside their livelihood, they earn somewhat still to the public. Okay, a couple things about this, and then I'll let you go. First, we see the type of thinking that is both a fictionalization of a real world problem, or responding to real world problems through this sort of like invention, as a means to persuade listeners to think about problems like putting thieves to death or capital punishment or enclosure, etc., as like broadly integrated, right? So crime is not an isolated event. It's not isolated within broader social systems, and it's not isolated within the individual. Instead, it's part of these like broader integrated systems. The second thing that I want you to note about this is it provides a preview for the type of thinking that is going to happen in the second book. That is to say, once we get to book 2, so at the close here, Hythloday is going to say, I've been traveling around the world. If you like my idea about capital punishment or public works projects as a response to capital punishment, then you're going to love what I have to say about Utopia. And so he says, let me find it, sorry. As he told us the many things that were amiss in those new discovered countries, so he reckoned up not a few things from which patterns might be taken for correcting the errors of these nations among whom we live, right? So these sort of fictions are pedagogical. They're mobilized in the service of both critique, but then also helping potentially intransigent audiences think through potential solutions. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it there. That's sort of like a very fast, broad overview of book 1, and then just quickly looking on to what's coming up next this week. You can see that we're gonna spend a little bit of time. I'll spend a little bit of time in the video talking about book 2 in terms of visualization, and then in the back half of the video for Thursday, I'm going to go over these examples of brochures that you can use to design your own flyer, which will be the last of the process documents required for the class and for this project. So just basically, you're going to create in Canva, Adobe Spark, Photoshop, like whatever tool you would like, a flyer, brochure, whichever is a better fit for your project, that at the minimum has 2 to 4 images, the title of your world, and some sort of top line explanation, and then you'll upload that file to your Google Doc by the 15th. All right, so we can talk a little bit more about that on Thursday. Thanks for paying attention. If you have any questions, just email me. Terrific. Thanks so much.